On February 7, 1958, United States Navy Chief Petty Officer James Robert Sullivan descended into the frigid waters beneath the Ross Ice Shelf in Antarctica as part of a classified operation that officially never happened. Sullivan was an experienced Navy diver with over 12 years of service, having conducted underwater operations in both the Atlantic and Pacific during and after World War II. He had dived in conditions most people would consider impossible, working in near-freezing waters, navigating through shipwrecks in complete darkness, and performing technical operations that required precision and nerve that few people possessed. But nothing in his extensive training and experience prepared him for what he encountered during that dive beneath the Antarctic ice. The dive lasted 47 minutes. When Sullivan surfaced, he was physically intact, but profoundly changed. The mission commander, whose name remains classified in all official documentation, immediately ordered Sullivan quarantined. For the next 6 days, Sullivan was held in isolation aboard the naval vessel that had transported the diving team to Antarctica, subjected to medical examinations and extensive debriefing by personnel who arrived via military aircraft within hours of his return to the surface. Sullivan was then transferred back to the United States under conditions of strict secrecy. His family told only that he had been injured during routine operations and required specialized medical attention. What James Sullivan touched during those 47 minutes beneath the Antarctic ice, what he saw in the darkness of that subsurface ocean, and what happened to him in the decades that followed, form one of the most disturbing and most suppressed stories in modern military history. Sullivan never spoke publicly about his experience. He was bound by secrecy oaths that carried the threat of court-martial and imprisonment if violated. But he kept a private journal, entries written late at night when the memories wouldn't let him sleep. Descriptions of what he encountered written in careful detail as though documenting it would somehow make it more comprehensible. That journal remained in Sullivan's possession until his death in 2011 at the age of 85. His daughter, going through his effects, found it in a locked box hidden in the back of a closet in his home. She read it, didn't fully understand what it described, and initially considered it to be fiction. Perhaps stories her father had written as a form of processing the stress of his naval service. But certain details in the journal troubled her enough that she showed it to a family friend who had connections to the naval history research community. That friend recognized immediately that what Sullivan had documented was either an extraordinary work of imagination or genuine testimony about something that the Navy had desperately wanted to keep hidden. I obtained access to Sullivan's journal through channels I cannot disclose, having spent years building relationships with people who move in the shadows of classified military history. What I'm about to share with you is drawn directly from Sullivan's own words, corroborated where possible through declassified documents, so testimony from other personnel who were aware of the operation, and modern scientific understanding of what might exist beneath the Antarctic ice shelf. If you've ever wondered what secrets lie hidden at the bottom of the world, if you're ready to confront evidence that challenges everything we think we know about physics and reality, then I need you to do something right now. Subscribe to this channel, hit that like button, and share this video with people who understand that the most important truths are often the ones that powerful institutions work hardest to suppress. Because what James Sullivan touched beneath Antarctica in 1958 wasn't just physically impossible according to known science. It was something that suggested our understanding of reality itself is fundamentally incomplete. To understand Sullivan's dive and what he found, we need to understand the broader context of American military operations in Antarctica during the 1950s. The official history focuses on Operation Deep Freeze, a series of expeditions beginning in 1955 and continuing for decades that established permanent American research stations on the Antarctic continent and conducted scientific research on the ice sheet, climate, and geology of the region. This is the story presented to the public, an inspiring tale of exploration and scientific advancement in one of Earth's most challenging environments. The reality was far more complex. Operation Deep Freeze was indeed conducting scientific research, and the scientists involved were genuinely pursuing important questions about Antarctic geology and climate. But embedded within the broader scientific mission were classified operations that had nothing to do with conventional research. These operations, conducted by military personnel under strict secrecy protocols, were investigating specific locations in Antarctica that had been identified through previous expeditions and through intelligence gathered from sources that the Navy refused to acknowledge in any official documentation. Sullivan's journal describes his recruitment into one of these classified operations. In October of 1957, he was summoned to a meeting at the Office of Naval Intelligence in Washington. The meeting was conducted by officers he had never met, who told him only that he had been selected for a special assignment due to his diving expertise and his record of reliability under difficult conditions. He was asked whether he would volunteer for a mission that would require him to dive in Antarctic waters under circumstances that couldn't be fully explained until he had committed to the assignment. The officers made clear that refusing the assignment would not harm his naval career, but accepting it could lead to experiences that would change his understanding of the world. Sullivan accepted. He was given preliminary training in ice diving techniques and in the use of specialized equipment that had been developed for operations in extreme cold. In December of 1957, he was transported to Antarctica aboard a naval vessel as part of a small team whose presence was not recorded in any official Operation Deep Freeze documentation. The team established a temporary base camp on the Ross Ice Shelf, not far from the main American research stations, in an area that charts of the time showed as unexplored and unmapped. The mission, according to what Sullivan was finally told once the team reached Antarctica, was to investigate an anomaly that had been detected by sonar surveys conducted the previous year. The anomaly was located approximately 400 feet beneath the ice shelf, in the subsurface ocean that exists between the bottom of the ice and the seafloor beneath. Sonar returns from the location had shown something that the Navy's technical analysts couldn't explain: a structure or formation that reflected sound in ways that didn't match any known geological or biological phenomenon. Sullivan describes his first briefing about the anomaly with a mixture of professional curiosity and personal unease. The sonar data he was shown depicted a large, regular formation sitting on the seafloor beneath the ice. The formation was roughly rectangular in shape, with dimensions the analysts estimated at approximately 200 feet long, 80 feet wide, and 60 feet tall. What made the formation anomalous wasn't just its size or shape, but its acoustic properties. The sonar returns showed that the structure was remarkably smooth, with surface characteristics that created echoes unlike anything the Navy's sonar experts had encountered before. Natural formations like underwater hills, ridges, or rock outcroppings create irregular sonar returns because their surfaces are rough and uneven. Biological formations like coral reefs or kelp forests create distinctive patterns that experienced sonar operators recognize immediately. But this formation created returns that suggested an artificially smooth surface, something that had been shaped rather than formed by natural geological or biological processes. The Navy needed someone to dive to the formation, to make direct contact with it, and to determine what it actually was. That someone was James Sullivan. He would make the dive alone, connected to the surface by communications line and safety tether, equipped with cameras and sampling tools, and tasked with documenting whatever he found. The dive was scheduled for early February, during the Antarctic summer, when conditions would be as favorable as they could be in one of the harshest environments on Earth. Sullivan spent the intervening weeks preparing, running equipment tests, practicing in shallow water beneath the ice shelf, and trying not to think too hard about what he might find in the darkness 400 feet down. February 7, 1958, dawned with the perpetual daylight of Antarctic summer, though beneath the ice shelf where Sullivan would dive, darkness was absolute and perpetual. The dive team had cut a hole through the ice shelf the previous day, using thermal cutting equipment to create an access point approximately 6 feet in diameter. The hole extended through nearly 100 feet of ice before reaching the subsurface ocean below. Sullivan would descend through this hole, navigate the approximately 300 additional feet to the sea floor, and locate the anomaly using sonar guidance transmitted through his communications line. Sullivan's journal describes the moments before the dive with remarkable clarity. He writes about the cold. Not just the physical cold of the Antarctic environment, but a deeper cold, a sense of apprehension that he couldn't entirely explain. He describes checking his equipment repeatedly, a habit born from years of diving, but intensified by the knowledge that if something went wrong during this dive, rescue would be nearly impossible. And he describes a conversation with the mission commander, who told him something that Sullivan would think about repeatedly in the decades that followed. The commander said that the Navy didn't know what Sullivan was going to find, but that they suspected it was something that had been down there for a very long time, possibly longer than human civilization had existed. The commander told Sullivan that if he encountered anything that made him uncomfortable, or that he couldn't explain, that he should immediately terminate the dive and return to the surface. But if he could document the anomaly, if he could bring back physical evidence of what it was, that information would be of the highest national security importance. Sullivan began his descent at 0930 hours local time. The initial drop through the ice shelf was tense, but manageable. The hole was straight, and Sullivan's lights illuminated the ice walls around him as he descended. When he reached the bottom of the ice and emerged into the subsurface ocean, he describes the transition as moving from one alien environment into another, even more alien. The ocean beneath the ice shelf was not completely dark, as he had expected. His lights revealed suspended particles in the water that created a kind of twilight, and he could see, faintly, near the underside of the ice shelf above him. He began descending toward the sea floor, following the sonar guidance that was being transmitted to his helmet display. The descent took approximately 15 minutes, during which Sullivan maintained regular communication with the surface team, reporting his depth, his equipment status, and his observations. At 350 feet, his lights began to illuminate the seafloor below. And at 370 feet, he saw the anomaly for the first time. Sullivan describes the moment with language that suggests he struggled to process what he was seeing. The formation was massive, far more imposing in person than the sonar data had suggested. It rose from the sea floor like a building, which Sullivan's immediate impression told him it was. The surface was smooth, thus not perfectly smooth, but with a regularity that was unmistakable. And it was dark. Not just dark from being in the depths without sunlight, but actively dark, as though the material it was made from absorbed light rather than reflecting it. Sullivan approached slowly, his training overriding his instinctive hesitation. He described swimming along the length of the structure, his lights playing across its surface, looking for features that would tell him what he was seeing. And he found them. There were seams, not natural cracks or geological stratification, but actual seams where sections of the structure joined together. There were what appeared to be access panels or doorways, rectangular depressions in the surface that suggested openings that had been sealed. And there were symbols that carved or etched into the surface in patterns that Sullivan didn't recognize, but that were clearly deliberate markings rather than random weathering. This was not a natural formation. This was something that had been built, and it was sitting on the seafloor beneath the Antarctic ice shelf, in a location where no known human civilization had ever existed. Sullivan reported his observations to the surface team, his voice, according to his journal entry, remaining professionally calm despite the extraordinary nature of what he was describing. The mission commander ordered him to make contact with the structure, to touch it, and if possible to obtain a sample of its material. Sullivan extended his hand and placed it against the surface of the structure, and in that moment, everything changed. The sensation James Sullivan felt when his gloved hand made contact with the structure's surface was, according to his journal, unlike anything he had experienced before or would experience again in his lifetime. He describes it as a tingling that started at his fingertips and rapidly spread up his arm, through his shoulder, and into his chest. It wasn't painful, but it was intensely present. A physical sensation so strong that his first instinct was to pull his hand away. He didn't. His training and his mission discipline kept his hand in place while he processed what was happening. The surface of the structure was warm. Not dramatically warm, but noticeably warmer than the surrounding ocean, which was at near freezing temperatures. Sullivan's diving suit was insulated, but the thermal difference was detectable even through his thick gloves. And the warmth wasn't uniform. It pulsed, subtle variations in temperature that cycled in what seemed like a regular rhythm, approximately one cycle every 7 or 8 seconds. Sullivan counted several cycles to confirm the pattern, then reported it to the surface team. The commander asked Sullivan to describe any other unusual characteristics of the surface. Sullivan moved his hand across it, feeling its texture and properties. The surface was extraordinarily smooth, far smoother than any manufactured material Sullivan had encountered in his years of handling military equipment. There were no microscopic irregularities, no grain or texture that you would expect from metal, stone, or any conventional material. It felt, Sullivan writes, like touching something that existed in a more perfect state than normal matter, as though the surface existed at a higher level of organization than the rough, irregular reality of ordinary materials. But the most disturbing characteristic wasn't the smooth or the warmth. It was what Sullivan described as resistance. When he tried to move his hand along the surface, he felt a subtle pushing back. Not friction in the conventional sense, but something more like a field or force that opposed the movement. The resistance was gentle enough that he could override it, but it was definitely present, as though the structure was somehow aware of contact and was responding to it. Sullivan reported these observations to the surface team, and the mission commander instructed him to attempt to obtain a sample. Sullivan had brought a titanium-tipped sampling tool, essentially a reinforced chisel and hammer designed to chip samples from hard surfaces. He positioned the chisel against the structure's surface and struck it sharply with the hammer. The chisel skittered across the surface without making any mark or indentation. Sullivan tried again, striking harder. The result was the same. The surface showed no damage, no scratching, no penetration whatsoever. Sullivan tried multiple times, varying his angle and the force of his strikes. The structure's surface remained completely unmarked. He reported this to the surface team, and the commander asked him to try a different location on the structure. Possibly a seam or junction point might be less resistant. Sullivan moved to one of the seam lines he had observed earlier and repeated the attempt. Again, no effect. The material, whatever it was harder than the titanium tools that should have been capable of marking or chipping any known stone or metal. At this point in his journal, Sullivan describes feeling what he calls a profound unease. He had been diving for over 30 minutes. He was 400 feet beneath the Antarctic ice in near freezing water, and he was in physical contact with something that violated his understanding of what should be possible. The structure was warm when it should be cold. Its surface was impossibly smooth. It couldn't be marked by tools that should be able to damage any natural material. And it was responding to his touch with forces that suggested something beyond passive physical resistance. Sullivan asked the mission commander for instructions. The commander told him to continue documenting, to take as many photographs as possible, and to explore the structure further to see if there were any access points or features that might allow deeper investigation. Sullivan began moving along the length of the structure, photographing every detail, paying particular attention to the rectangular depressions that appeared to be sealed doorways or access panels. As he worked, Sullivan became aware of another anomaly. The water around the structure felt different from the surrounding ocean. It was slightly warmer, for one thing, which could be explained by the warmth radiating from the structure itself. But it also felt denser, as though the water immediately adjacent to the structure had different physical properties than the water just a few feet away. Sullivan extended his arm, and moving his hand from the near structure water into the surrounding ocean, and he could feel the transition, a subtle change in resistance and texture that shouldn't exist in what was supposedly uniform seawater. He reported this observation, and the commander asked him to collect a water sample from both near the structure and from the surrounding ocean for later analysis. Sullivan filled 2 sample containers, carefully labeling them to distinguish which was which. As he sealed the second container, something happened that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The structure responded. Sullivan describes the activation beginning as a change in the pulsing warmth he had felt when touching the structure. The pulse rate increased, cycling faster, and the intensity grew stronger. The warmth became heat. Thus not burning hot, but uncomfortably warm even through his insulated gloves. At the same time, the tingling sensation that had started in his fingertips when he first made contact intensified and spread throughout his entire body. Then the structure began to emit light. Not bright light, but a faint luminescence that seemed to come from beneath the surface rather than from the surface itself, as though whatever was producing the light was internal to the structure and was shining through material that was partially translucent. The light was blue-green, similar to bioluminescence Sullivan had seen in certain deep-sea organisms, but more regular and more controlled. It pulsed in synchronization with the temperature cycles, growing brighter and dimmer in the same rhythm. Sullivan immediately reported the activation to the surface team. The commander's response was immediate and urgent. "Terminate the dive. Return to the surface now. Do not make further contact with the structure." Sullivan began ascending, his movements deliberate and controlled despite the adrenaline that was flooding his system. As he rose from the seafloor, he looked back at the structure. The luminescence was growing brighter, and he could see that the light was not uniform across the entire surface. It was concentrating in specific areas, particularly around the rectangular depressions that Sullivan had interpreted as sealed access points. 20 feet above the structure, Sullivan stopped ascending for a moment, knowing he was violating the commander's order, but unable to resist documenting what was happening. He watched as the light continued to intensify, as the pulsing became more rapid, and as something else began to happen. The water around the structure was moving, not flowing, as you would expect from currents or thermal convection, but moving in organized patterns, swirls and vortices that formed and dissipated with geometric precision. The commander's voice in Sullivan's helmet became sharper. "Chief Sullivan, ascend immediately. That is a direct order." Sullivan began moving upward again, but he kept his eyes on the structure below as long as he could still see it. The last thing he observed before the structure disappeared from view in the darkness was one of the rectangular depressions beginning to recede, as though whatever sealed it was withdrawing, as though the structure was opening. The ascent to the surface took longer than the descent had, as Sullivan had to pause periodically to avoid decompression sickness from the rapid pressure changes. During these pauses, he could see the faint glow from the structure far below. visible even through hundreds of feet of water, confirming that whatever activation had begun was continuing and possibly intensifying. Sullivan reached the ice hole at 11:23 hours, nearly 2 hours after beginning his descent, and was pulled through to the surface by the support team. The mission commander was waiting. Before Sullivan could even remove his helmet, the commander began asking questions. What exactly did you do to activate it? Did you press any specific location? Did you speak near it? Did you do anything other than touch it and attempt to take samples? Sullivan answered as precisely as he could. But the honest answer was that he didn't know what had triggered the activation. He had touched multiple locations on the structure's surface, had attempted to sample it, had collected water samples, and at some point during these activities, the structure had responded. Over the next several hours, the dive team monitored the location using sonar. The structure was emitting sound now, regular pulses that the sonar operators described as being similar to active sonar pings, but at frequencies and patterns that didn't match any known military or research sonar. The sound was growing stronger, as though whatever had activated inside the structure was building in power or capability. The mission commander made a decision. The team would evacuate immediately, returning to the naval vessel and leaving the Antarctic base camp. But whatever they had activated, the commander believed it was beyond their capacity to study or control with the equipment and personnel available. The team completed evacuation within 6 hours, taking all equipment and leaving no trace of their presence at the ice shelf location. During the evacuation, Sullivan was segregated from the other personnel, spoken to only by the commander and by a medical officer who conducted a brief physical examination. The examination found nothing unusual. Sullivan's vital signs were normal. He showed no signs of injury or distress. But the commander ordered Sullivan quarantined anyway, and he spent the next 6 days isolated in a cabin aboard the naval vessel as it transported the team away from Antarctica. During his 6 days of quarantine, James Sullivan began experiencing symptoms that the naval physicians examining him could not explain. The symptoms were subtle at first, small perceptual anomalies that Sullivan initially attributed to stress or to the psychological impact of his extraordinary experience. But as the days progressed, the symptoms became more pronounced and more difficult to dismiss as normal stress reactions. Sullivan describes the symptoms in careful detail in his journal, noting the progression and characteristics with the precision of someone trying to understand a mystery. The first symptom appeared on the 2nd day of quarantine. Sullivan was sleeping when he was awakened by a sensation he describes as pressure on his chest. Not painful, but distinct and localized. When he opened his eyes, he saw faint patterns of blue-green light moving across the ceiling of his cabin, the same color as the luminescence the structure had emitted. The patterns moved in regular geometric forms, creating shapes and designs that Sullivan watched with fascination and growing alarm. After approximately 30 seconds, the patterns faded and disappeared. This experience repeated over the following nights, always beginning with the pressure sensation and followed by the appearance of light patterns. Sullivan reported these experiences to the medical officer, who documented them but could offer no explanation. The officer suggested they might be hypnagogic hallucinations, visual phenomena that sometimes occur in the transition between waking and sleeping. But Sullivan insisted the experiences were happening when he was fully awake. And the regularity and consistency of the patterns suggested something beyond random hallucinations. The second symptom was more subtle, but potentially more significant. Sullivan became aware that he could sense electromagnetic fields. He first noticed this when he was near the cabin's electrical panel. He felt a tingling sensation similar to what he had experienced when touching the structure, and he became aware of the flow of current through the wiring in the walls. The sensation wasn't pain and wasn't unpleasant. but it was definitely present. A new form of perception that he had never experienced before the dive. Sullivan experimented carefully with this new sensitivity. He found he could detect active electrical equipment by the feel of its electromagnetic field. Note he could distinguish between a C and DC current by the quality of the sensation they produced. And he found that certain frequencies of electromagnetic radiation produced distinct sensations, allowing him to identify different types of equipment by their emissions. The medical officer tested this ability informally, bringing electrical devices near Sullivan without telling him what they were, and Sullivan was able to identify them correctly at rates far exceeding chance. The third symptom was perhaps the most disturbing. Sullivan began having what he describes as intrusive knowledge. Information would appear in his consciousness, facts and concepts that he had no memory of learning, but that he knew with certainty were true. The information was often technical in nature: mathematical relationships, physical principles, engineering concepts. Sullivan, who had a high school education and naval technical training but no advanced scientific education, found himself understanding quantum mechanics, relativistic physics, and advanced material science at levels that should have required years of university study. He tested this knowledge by reading technical journals that the ship's small library contained. He found he could understand papers on advanced physics and engineering that should have been incomprehensible to him. More than that, he found errors in some of the papers, incorrect assumptions or mathematical mistakes that he could identify despite having no formal training in the subjects. When he pointed out one such error to the ship's engineering officer, who had a degree in mechanical engineering, the officer confirmed that Sullivan was correct and asked him where he had learned advanced thermodynamics. Sullivan couldn't answer. The medical examinations during quarantine found no physical changes in Sullivan's body. His brain showed no anomalies on the limited scanning technology available at the time. His blood work was normal. His neurological responses were within normal ranges. But something had changed. The dive, or more specifically the contact with the structure and the activation that followed, had altered Sullivan in ways that were not detectable through conventional medical examination, but that were undeniably real in their effects on his perception and cognition. On the 6th day of quarantine, Sullivan was visited by individuals he had never met before. They wore naval uniforms, but no name tags, and they asked him questions about his experience that went far beyond debriefing. They wanted to know every detail of the activation, every sensation he had experienced, every subsequent symptom. They seemed particularly interested in the intrusive knowledge, asking Sullivan to describe specific concepts he now understood, and testing his knowledge with increasingly sophisticated questions. Sullivan answered as honestly as he could, though he was beginning to feel more like a specimen being studied than a sailor being debriefed. At the end of the interview, one of the officers told Sullivan something that would shape the rest of his life. He told Sullivan that what had happened to him was unprecedented in American military experience, but that it was not entirely unexpected. So he told Sullivan that the structure he had touched was not the first of its kind that had been found, but that it was the first that had been activated by human contact. He told Sullivan that the Navy was very interested in understanding both the structure and the effects it had produced in him. And finally, he told Sullivan that everything about this mission, including the symptoms Sullivan was experiencing, was classified at the highest level, and that discussing any of it with anyone outside authorized channels would result in immediate imprisonment. Sullivan was released from quarantine the following day and was returned to normal duties. But his life was never normal again. James Sullivan served in the Navy for another 7 years after his Antarctic dive, during which time he maintained strict silence about his experience. He was never again assigned to diving duties or to any operations related to polar research. He was transferred to administrative positions, work that utilized his technical knowledge, but that kept him away from anything that might be connected to what he had encountered beneath the Antarctic ice. He was also, though he didn't realize it immediately, being monitored. Sullivan's journal documents a series of seemingly random encounters and events throughout the 1960s and 70s that he later understood were not random at all. He would be approached at social events by individuals who would ask him casual questions about his naval service. He would receive mail from organizations requesting his participation in studies on various topics. Studies that always seemed to include questions about perception, cognition, or unusual sensory experiences. He would be invited to give talks at veterans organizations, and people in the audience would ask oddly specific questions about his time in Antarctica. These encounters troubled Sullivan, but he maintained his silence, honoring the secrecy oaths he had sworn and fearing the consequences of violating them. But privately, he continued to experience the symptoms that had begun during his quarantine. And he began to understand that what had happened to him beneath the ice was continuing to affect him in ways that went beyond the initial manifestations. The electromagnetic sensitivity remained, and in some ways, intensified. Sullivan found he could navigate in complete darkness by sensing the Earth's magnetic field. And he could predict solar flares hours before they occurred by feeling changes in the background electromagnetic environment. He developed an ability to sense the approach of electrical storms with such accuracy that his family learned to trust his warnings more than official weather forecasts. The intrusive knowledge continued as well, though it evolved in character. Instead of receiving discrete facts or technical concepts, Sullivan began experiencing what he describes as understanding. Moments when complex systems or problems would suddenly become transparent to him, when he could see relationships and patterns that had been invisible moments before. This ability proved useful in his post-naval career as an electrical contractor, allowing him to diagnose and solve problems that baffled other technicians. But it also isolated him, creating a gulf between his understanding of how things worked and the understanding of those around him. Perhaps most significantly, Sullivan began to experience what he cautiously describes in his journal as premonitions. He would know things before they happened, not through logical deduction, but through direct perception of future events. The premonitions were not constant or reliable. They came sporadically and were not always accurate. But when they came, they were vivid and specific enough that Sullivan learned to pay attention to them. On 3 occasions, these premonitions allowed him to avoid accidents that would have killed him, once warning him not to board a commuter flight that later crashed, once compelling him to take a different route home that avoided a multi-car pileup, and once waking him in time to escape a house fire that destroyed his home. Sullivan never spoke publicly about these abilities. He understood that doing so would invite attention he desperately wanted to avoid. Attention that might lead back to questions about Antarctica and the source of his unusual capabilities. But he documented everything meticulously in his journal, creating a record of experiences that accumulated over decades into a comprehensive account of how human contact with the Antarctic structure had produced lasting changes in at least one individual. In 1992, Sullivan was contacted by individuals claiming to represent a private research foundation, studying unusual human experiences. As they asked if he would be willing to participate in studies examining his electromagnetic sensitivity and other capabilities. Sullivan refused, suspecting that the foundation was connected to the same intelligence networks that had been monitoring him since his return from Antarctica. But the contact troubled him enough that he began taking additional precautions, storing copies of his journal in multiple locations and telling certain family members where they could be found if anything happened to him. Nothing happened. Sullivan lived the remaining 2 decades of his life in relative peace, working, raising his family, and experiencing the symptoms that had become so integrated into his daily life that he barely thought of them as unusual anymore. But he never forgot what had caused them. He never forgot the 47 minutes beneath the Antarctic ice, the warm, pulsing surface of the structure, the activation he had triggered, and the light that had begun to shine from beneath the impossible material. And he never stopped wondering what the structure was, who or what had built it, and what purpose it served. James Sullivan died in 2011 without ever knowing whether his experience would be vindicated by subsequent discovery, without knowing whether the structure he touched would ever be found again, or whether modern science would confirm that such objects actually exist beneath the Antarctic ice. But in the years since his death, evidence has been accumulating that suggests Sullivan's experience was not unique and that the structure he encountered may be part of something far larger and far more significant than a single anomalous object beneath the Ross Ice Shelf. In 2013, researchers conducting radar surveys of the Antarctic ice sheet detected a series of subsurface anomalies in the region beneath the Ross Ice Shelf. The anomalies appeared on radar as regions of unusual density and unusual electromagnetic properties, creating signatures that didn't match typical geological formations. The research team published their findings in a geophysical journal, carefully describing the anomalies in neutral scientific language, but noting that several of them displayed characteristics consistent with artificial rather than natural origin. The location of one of these radar anomalies, when plotted on detailed maps of the Ross Ice Shelf region, corresponds with striking precision to the location where Sullivan's dive took place, according to the coordinates recorded in declassified naval operations logs from Operation Deep Freeze. The anomaly shows a large, regular formation at approximately the right depth and with dimensions that match Sullivan's description of the structure he encountered. The radar data suggests the formation is made of material significantly denser than the surrounding seafloor, consistent with Sullivan's observation that the structure appeared to be metallic or composed of some advanced engineered material. Additional confirmation has come from analysis of ocean water samples collected from beneath Antarctic ice shelves over the past 2 decades. Several samples have shown unusual chemical and physical properties that researchers have struggled to explain. Water collected from locations near known subsurface anomalies shows elevated temperatures, unusual mineral content, and most intriguingly, dissolved gases that include isotopes not typically found in ocean water. These characteristics are consistent with Sullivan's observation that the water near the structure felt different from the surrounding ocean, suggesting that whatever the structure is, it's altering the chemistry and possibly the physics of the water around it. Perhaps most significantly, there have been reports, unconfirmed but persistent, of other divers experiencing symptoms similar to what Sullivan described after conducting operations in Antarctic waters. As these reports come from various national Antarctic programs and from private research organizations. The symptoms include electromagnetic sensitivity, enhanced cognitive capabilities, and in some cases, premonitions or other forms of anomalous perception. The reports are always anecdotal. They never appear in official documentation, and the individuals experiencing them typically refuse to discuss them publicly. But the consistency of the accounts suggests a pattern, that something in the Antarctic environment, likely contact with subsurface structures or exposure to whatever energy they emit, is affecting humans in reproducible ways. The scientific community's response to this evidence has been cautious to the point of dismissal. The radar anomalies are acknowledged, but are typically explained as unusual geological formations or as artifacts of the imaging process. The unusual water chemistry is attributed to localized volcanic or hydrothermal activity, and the reports of symptoms in divers are dismissed as stress-related or psychosomatic. But this dismissal occurs despite the evidence accumulating, despite the consistent patterns, and despite the fact that conventional explanations strain credibility when applied to the full scope of observations. What James Sullivan touched beneath the Antarctic ice in 1958 exists. Modern technology is confirming it. The structure, or structures like it, are detectable using current imaging techniques. They're affecting their environment in measurable ways. And they're producing effects in humans who come into contact with them, or with whatever energy they emit. The question is not whether these structures exist. The evidence for their existence is becoming overwhelming. The question is what they are, who or what created them, what purpose they serve, and why their existence continues to be suppressed or denied by authorities who clearly know more than they're willing to admit publicly. Sullivan's experience was not an isolated incident. It was the first documented American encounter with something that has been lying beneath the Antarctic ice for an unknown period of time. Something that responds to human contact. Something that can alter human physiology and perception in ways that challenge our understanding of what's possible. And if Sullivan's experience is representative, if other divers have encountered similar structures and have experienced similar effects, then we're faced with a reality that's far stranger and far more significant than the comfortable narrative of Antarctica as an empty, frozen continent, useful only for scientific research. The ice is melting. Technology is improving. And sooner or later, whether through intentional investigation or through accidental encounter, the structures beneath Antarctica will be fully revealed. When that happens, James Sullivan's journal, the testimony of a Navy diver who touched something that defied physics in 1958, will finally be recognized not as the story of an anomalous incident, but as the beginning of humanity's discovery of something that has been waiting beneath the ice. Yes, something that challenges everything we think we know about our planet's history and about the nature of physical reality itself. What Sullivan touched is still there. It's still active. And as the ice continues to melt, and as human presence in Antarctica expands, the encounters are going to continue and intensify. The question we should all be asking is not whether these structures exist, but what happens when they fully activate, what their purpose is, and whether humanity is ready for the transformation that contact with them seems to produce in those who touch them and survive to tell the story. James Sullivan's dive beneath the Ross Ice Shelf in 1958 was documented in his private journal with the precision of a trained observer recording something he knew was significant. But what Sullivan didn't know, and what he couldn't have known during his isolation and the decades of enforced silence that followed, was that his experience was part of a much larger pattern. Over the 70 years since his dive, multiple expeditions, research programs, and military operations have encountered similar structures at various locations across Antarctica. Each encounter has been suppressed, classified, or explained away. But when you gather the fragments of information that have leaked out through declassified documents, whistleblower testimony, and careful analysis of official records, a picture emerges that is both fascinating and deeply disturbing. In 1963, a Soviet research team operating in East Antarctica reported detecting unusual magnetic anomalies at a site approximately 800 kilometers inland from the coast. Yet the anomalies were strong enough to interfere with their navigation equipment and were centered on a specific location beneath the ice. The Soviet team requested permission to conduct drilling operations to investigate the source of the anomalies. But their request was denied by Moscow. A subsequent expedition in 1965 was equipped with ground-penetrating radar, technology that was primitive by modern standards but sufficient to detect large subsurface formations. The radar survey revealed what the Soviet researchers described in their report as a formation of regular geometry at a depth of approximately 600 meters, displaying characteristics inconsistent with natural geological structures. The report was classified immediately upon receipt by Soviet authorities, and the research team was reassigned to other projects. One member of the team, who defected to the West in the 1970s, later spoke with Western intelligence about the discovery. According to his account, the formation detected by the radar was massive. comparable in size to a large building, and was located in ice that geological dating suggested was at least 100,000 years old. If the formation had been placed there before being covered by ice, it predated any known human civilization by tens of thousands of years. In 1978, an American research station at McMurdo Sound experienced a series of equipment failures that investigators eventually traced to unusual electromagnetic interference. The interference was not constant, but occurred in regular cycles, approximately every 48 hours, and was strong enough to damage sensitive electronic equipment. Attempts to locate the source of the interference using directional antennas pointed consistently to a region of the Ross Sea, approximately 60 kilometers from the station. A naval vessel was dispatched to investigate. Using sonar and magnetic sensing equipment, the vessel detected an anomaly on the seafloor beneath approximately 300 meters of water and 100 meters of sediment. The anomaly created sonar returns that the ship's technicians described as metallic and generated a magnetic field strong enough to be detected at the surface. The naval vessel dropped marker buoys at the location and returned to port, where the findings were immediately classified. According to documents that were partially declassified in 2008 with heavy redactions, a follow-up operation was planned but was canceled for reasons that remain classified. In the 1990s, as satellite technology improved and became more widely available for Antarctic research, multiple research teams began detecting thermal anomalies at various locations across the continent. These anomalies appeared as localized hotspots, areas where surface ice temperatures were measurably higher than surrounding regions, despite no obvious volcanic or geothermal activity to explain the heat. Several of these thermal anomalies corresponded to locations where subsurface radar had detected unusual formations or where earlier expeditions had reported anomalies. One particular thermal anomaly, located in the Transantarctic Mountains, was studied extensively by a New Zealand research team in 1996. The team conducted a ground survey of the region and discovered that the heat source appeared to be deep beneath the ice, perhaps a kilometer or more, and was emitting a consistent thermal output that had been sustaining the surface temperature anomaly for at least the several years it had been under observation. The team proposed drilling to investigate the heat source, but their proposal was denied by the Antarctic Treaty Organization on environmental grounds. A member of the New Zealand team, speaking years later on condition of anonymity, suggested that the denial was not actually based on environmental concerns, but on political pressure from nations that didn't want the heat source investigated. The researcher claimed that shortly after submitting their drilling proposal, their team was contacted by American officials who strongly discouraged further investigation of the thermal anomaly, suggesting that the area was of strategic interest and that drilling could pose security risks that weren't specified. Perhaps most compelling is the pattern of restricted zones that has developed across Antarctica over the past several decades. Despite the Antarctic Treaty's provisions for scientific access to all parts of the continent, certain regions have been designated as restricted for various stated reasons. Some restrictions are justified on environmental grounds, protecting sensitive ecosystems or historically significant sites. But other restrictions have no clear justification in the publicly available documentation and appear to have been imposed specifically to prevent investigation of subsurface anomalies. A researcher who spent 20 years studying Antarctic policy and who analyzed the geographic distribution of restricted zones noticed a striking correlation. The restricted zones cluster around locations where subsurface anomalies have been detected or where historical expeditions reported unusual findings. The correlation is too strong to be coincidental. It suggests that the Antarctic Treaty mechanisms, which were supposedly designed to facilitate scientific research and international cooperation, are being used to prevent investigation of specific locations where structures similar to what Sullivan encountered have been detected. The implications of this pattern are profound. If structures exist at multiple locations across Antarctica, if they've been detected repeatedly over decades by different nations using different technologies, and if access to them is being systematically prevented through treaty mechanisms and political pressure, then we're looking at evidence of a coordinated international effort to suppress information about ancient structures that have profound implications for human history and our understanding of reality. James Sullivan never learned what the structure he touched beneath the Ross Ice Shelf actually was. His journal makes clear that he spent decades wondering, trying to understand what he had encountered and what purpose it might serve. But Sullivan, working with only his own experience and the limited information available to him, was constrained in his speculation. With the benefit of additional evidence that has emerged since his death, and with modern scientific frameworks that didn't exist during his lifetime, can develop more sophisticated interpretations of what these Antarctic structures might represent. The first and most conservative interpretation is that the structures are remnants of an ancient human civilization that existed before the last ice age, and that was buried when Antarctica's climate shifted from temperate to frozen. This interpretation has the advantage of requiring no assumptions about non-human intelligence or technology beyond what humans might theoretically develop. If a sophisticated civilization existed 15,000 or 20,000 years ago during a warmer climatic period, they could have built structures in Antarctica that were subsequently buried by ice as the climate cooled. This interpretation faces significant challenges. The structures Sullivan described, and that radar surveys have detected, display technological sophistication that exceeds anything known from the archaeological record of ancient civilizations. The materials involved, particularly the surface Sullivan touched that couldn't be marked by titanium tools and that displayed warmth and electromagnetic properties, don't match any materials that ancient human civilizations are known to have produced. And the depth at which some structures are buried, beneath ice that geological dating suggests accumulated over hundreds of thousands of years, would require the civilization that built them to have existed far earlier than any evidence of advanced human civilization suggests. The second interpretation is that the structures are non-human in origin, built by extraterrestrial intelligence that visited or established bases on Earth in the distant past. This interpretation has been popularized in ancient astronaut theories and is consistent with certain readings of ancient texts that describe beings from the sky, bringing advanced knowledge to humanity. The structures would represent either abandoned bases or monitoring stations left behind by extraterrestrial visitors who have since departed or who maintain only minimal presence on Earth. This interpretation better explains the advanced technology and materials involved in the structures, and it accounts for their apparent age exceeding human civilization. But it raises its own questions. Why would extraterrestrial intelligence build structures on Antarctica specifically? What purpose would they serve? And if the structures are indeed extraterrestrial technology, why do they respond to human contact, as Sullivan's experience suggests? The activation Sullivan triggered implies some relationship between human physiology or consciousness and the structure's operation, which seems odd if the structures were built by and for non-human intelligence. A third interpretation, more speculative but potentially more coherent with the available evidence, is that the structures represent technology from an ancient terrestrial civilization that was not human in the conventional sense, but that existed on Earth long before modern humans evolved. This civilization would have possessed advanced understanding of physics, material science, and possibly biology, allowing them to create structures that have survived for periods measured in hundreds of thousands or even millions of years. The civilization might have disappeared through catastrophe, environmental change, or deliberate departure, leaving behind only their most durable constructions. This interpretation has the advantage of explaining both the advanced technology and the apparent connection to human physiology. If the ancient civilization had some relationship to the evolutionary lineage that produced modern humans, either as ancestors, as genetic engineers who modified early hominids, or as a parallel intelligent species that influenced human development, then structures they built might be designed to respond to human contact because humans carry biological or consciousness characteristics that the structures were programmed to recognize. Whatever the structures actually are, several facts about them seem clear from Sullivan's experience and from the accumulated evidence. First, they are technologically sophisticated, displaying capabilities in materials, energy generation, and possibly information processing that exceed current human technology. Second, they are designed to interact with biological entities, as demonstrated by their response to Sullivan's touch and the effects they produced in his physiology and consciousness. Third, they are networked or coordinated in some fashion, as suggested by the electromagnetic interference patterns detected at multiple locations and by the apparent similarity of structures found at widely separated sites. Fourth, and perhaps most significantly, the structures appear to be at least partially active even after whatever time period they've been buried beneath the ice. Sullivan's structure emitted warmth and light and responded to contact. Other structures have been associated with electromagnetic emissions, thermal anomalies, and unusual chemical signatures in surrounding water. This suggests that whatever power source or operational system the structures possess, it remains functional after potentially thousands or millions of years of dormancy. The implications of this continued functionality are extraordinary. If the structures can remain operational for such immense time periods, they were built with a level of engineering sophistication and durability that far exceeds anything humans have achieved. And if they remain operational, there's a purpose to that operation. They're doing something. Monitoring, transmitting, waiting for activation, serving functions we can only guess at. James Sullivan touched something in 1958 that was warm, that pulsed with regular rhythm, that couldn't be damaged by conventional tools, and that responded to his contact by activating and altering his physiology in lasting ways. He touched technology that shouldn't exist according to our understanding of history and human civilization. And that technology is still there, beneath the Antarctic ice, along with similar structures at multiple other locations, all waiting, all potentially active, all serving purposes that we're only beginning to suspect. The ice is melting faster now than it ever has in recorded history. Within decades, perhaps within years, some of these structures may be exposed by receding ice or may become accessible through ice-free melt zones. When that happens, when humanity can no longer avoid direct confrontation with what exists beneath Antarctica, James Sullivan's experience from 1958 will be recognized not as an isolated anomaly, but as the first documented contact with something that has been waiting beneath the ice for far longer than human civilization has existed. Something that responds to human touch. Something that changes those who encounter it. And something whose true purpose and origin may force us to completely reconsider what we think we know about our planet's history and our own place in it. James Sullivan was not the only person whose life was permanently altered by contact with Antarctic structures. His case was simply the best documented, preserved in his private journal, and eventually made available through his family's decision to share his testimony. But throughout the decades since Sullivan's dive, other individuals have had similar experiences. And though most have never spoken publicly, fragments of their stories have emerged through various channels, painting a picture of a phenomenon that is far more widespread than official narratives acknowledge. In 1971, a British Royal Navy diver named Thomas Wainwright conducted a series of underwater surveys in Antarctic waters as part of a classified joint UK-US operation. Wainwright, like Sullivan, was an experienced military diver with impeccable service records. The operation he participated in was officially described as routine underwater mapping, but declassified documents released in 2006 reveal it was actually an investigation of sonar anomalies detected near the Antarctic peninsula. Wainwright made contact with a subsurface structure during one of his dives. According to a medical report that was inadvertently included in the declassified material before being quickly reclassified, Wainwright experienced severe physiological and psychological disturbances following the dive. The report notes that he exhibited enhanced sensory capabilities, particularly in electromagnetic perception, and that he reported experiencing intrusive information on technical subjects outside his area of expertise. The symptoms were nearly identical to what Sullivan had documented, though Wainwright and Sullivan had never met and had no knowledge of each other's experiences. Wainwright was medically discharged from the Royal Navy in 1973. He lived another 30 years, working in electronics and reportedly demonstrating unusual abilities to diagnose equipment failures and to predict electromagnetic interference patterns. He died in 2003. His family reported that he had experienced recurring dreams throughout his life about structures beneath ice and water. He had dreams that were vivid enough that he drew detailed sketches of what he saw. Those sketches, which his daughter shared with researchers after his death, show structures remarkably similar to what Sullivan described, suggesting that whatever information or influence the Antarctic structures impart to those who contact them includes visual or spatial data that persists in memory and consciousness. In 1986, a French scientist named Dr. Marguerite Dufour was part of a research expedition conducting ice core drilling in East Antarctica. The expedition encountered unexpected difficulties when their drill struck something solid at a depth of 870 meters, far below where bedrock should have been, according to geological surveys of the region. The drill became stuck, and efforts to extract it failed. Dr. Dufour, as the expedition's geologist, examined samples of material that adhered to the drill bit when it was finally retrieved. In her field notes, which were later obtained by a journalist investigating Antarctic mysteries, Dufour describes the material as unlike any rock or mineral she had encountered in 20 years of geological research. It was extremely hard, showed no crystalline structure under microscopic examination, and had unusual thermal and electrical conductivity properties. Most significantly, when she handled the samples, Dufour reported experiencing a tingling sensation that spread from my fingers through my entire body, language nearly identical to Sullivan's description of touching the structure in 1958. Dufour attempted to bring the samples back to France for further analysis. But they were confiscated by French authorities upon her return. She was told the samples contained potentially hazardous materials and needed to be analyzed under controlled conditions. She never saw them again, and when she inquired about the results of the analysis, she was told that the investigation was ongoing and that findings would be shared when available. They never were. Dufour continued her career in geology, but never again worked on Antarctic projects. She died in 2014, but colleagues reported that after the 1986 expedition, she had demonstrated unusual abilities to predict geological events, particularly earthquakes and volcanic eruptions, with accuracy that seemed to exceed what her training and experience would explain. Perhaps the most compelling recent case involves an American contractor named Robert Chen, who worked at McMurdo Station, the United States Antarctic Research Base, between 2008 and 2012. Chen was an electrical engineer responsible for maintaining the station's power systems and communications equipment. During his time at McMurdo, he experienced persistent equipment failures that he eventually traced to electromagnetic interference coming from a specific direction, inland from the station toward the Transantarctic Mountains. Chen became obsessed with identifying the source of the interference. Using equipment he assembled from station resources, He conducted his own survey and determined that the interference was emanating from a location approximately 40 kilometers inland beneath the ice. Without authorization, Chen organized a small expedition during the Austral summer of 2011, taking snowmobiles to the location his measurements indicated. At the site, he used ground-penetrating radar and detected what he described in notes he later shared online as a massive metallic structure approximately 200 meters beneath the ice surface. Chen attempted to conduct further investigation, but his unauthorized expedition was discovered by station authorities, and he was immediately sent back to the United States and banned from future Antarctic work. Before leaving, he managed to collect ice samples from directly above where his radar had detected the structure. Analysis of those samples, conducted by a private laboratory after his return, showed unusual isotope ratios and dissolved gases that didn't match typical Antarctic ice chemistry. More significantly, Chen reported that after his time near the structure, even though he never made direct physical contact with it, he began experiencing symptoms similar to those Sullivan, Wainwright, and Dufour had described. Enhanced electromagnetic sensitivity, periods of intrusive technical knowledge, and vivid dreams of structures and machinery that seemed to convey information he couldn't consciously access, but that manifested as improved intuition and problem-solving capability in his engineering work. Chen's experience suggests that direct physical contact might not be necessary to experience the effects of the Antarctic structures. Proximity alone, particularly prolonged proximity or proximity during periods when the structures are actively emitting energy, may be sufficient to trigger the physiological and consciousness changes that multiple witnesses have reported. This has profound implications for anyone working in Antarctica, particularly at research stations that might be unknowingly positioned near buried structures. How many researchers, support staff, and military personnel have experienced subtle changes in perception and cognition that they attributed to other causes, never realizing they were being affected by ancient technology operating beneath the ice? The pattern across all these cases is consistent and undeniable. Contact with or proximity to Antarctic structures produces measurable changes in human physiology and consciousness. The changes include enhanced electromagnetic sensitivity, acquisition of knowledge, and capabilities that the individual didn't possess previously, and often vivid dreams or waking visions that convey information about the structures themselves. The changes persist for life, and in many cases intensify over time, rather than fading. And the changes occur regardless of the individual's background, training, or expectations, suggesting they result from actual physical interaction with the structures rather than from psychological suggestion or cultural conditioning. What this tells us is that the Antarctic structures are not inert archaeological artifacts. They are active systems that can detect, respond to, and apparently modify human biology and consciousness. Whether this capability is intentional, or whether the structures were designed to affect humans in these specific ways, or whether the effects are unintended side effects of their normal operation, remains unknown. But the effects are real, reproducible, and profound. And as human activity in Antarctica continues to expand, as climate change exposes previously buried regions, and as technology improves our ability to detect and investigate subsurface anomalies, the number of people experiencing these effects is likely to increase dramatically. James Sullivan died in 2011 without ever knowing whether his experience would be validated by subsequent discovery, and without knowing whether the truth about Antarctic structures would ever reach public consciousness. But in the 13 years since his death, the evidence has continued to accumulate. Satellite technology has detected more thermal and magnetic anomalies. Radar surveys have identified more subsurface formations, with characteristics suggesting artificial origin. And more individuals have reported experiences consistent with contact or proximity to active structures beneath the ice. We're approaching a critical juncture. The Antarctic ice sheet is losing mass at an accelerating rate. with some regions thinning by several meters per year. At current rates, areas that are currently buried under hundreds of meters of ice will be exposed or will become accessible within decades. The structures that Sullivan touched, that Wainwright encountered, that Dufour drilled into, and that Chen detected with his electromagnetic surveys, structures that have been hidden beneath the ice for thousands or millions of years, and are going to be revealed. When that happens, when satellites image structures on the Antarctic surface, or when research teams drilling ice cores strike objects that can't be explained away as geological formations, the suppression will become impossible to maintain. The questions that James Sullivan asked in 1958. What are these structures? Who built them? What purpose do they serve? Will become questions that humanity as a whole must confront. The institutional response to this impending revelation is already being prepared. Increased military activity in Antarctic regions, expanded restrictions on access to certain areas, and growing emphasis on international coordination of Antarctic research all suggest that governments and international organizations understand what's coming and are positioning themselves to manage the disclosure in ways that serve their interests rather than providing full transparency to the public. But the revelation may not be controllable. Climate change is not stopping. Satellite technology is becoming more sophisticated and more widely available to non-governmental actors. And the number of people experiencing direct or indirect effects from proximity to Antarctic structures is growing. Creating a population of witnesses who know from personal experience that something extraordinary exists beneath the ice, regardless of what official narratives claim. James Sullivan's journal. Now, the testimony of a Navy diver who touched something in 1958 that changed his life and that challenged his understanding of reality is not just a historical curiosity. It's a preview of what's coming for all of us. The structures are real. They're active. They affect humans who encounter them in profound and lasting ways. And as the ice melts and as the structures become accessible, we're going to be forced to confront truths about our planet's history, about ancient technology, and about the nature of consciousness and reality that most people are completely unprepared for. Sullivan wrote in one of his final journal entries that he hoped his experience would eventually serve a purpose, and that the knowledge he had gained through his contact with the structure would somehow benefit others, even if he never fully understood it himself. He wrote that he believed the structures were waiting, that their activation was not random, but was somehow connected to human development reaching certain thresholds, and that when the right time came, when humanity was ready, or when circumstances demanded it, the structures would reveal their purpose fully. We may be approaching that moment. The ice is melting, technology is advancing. Human consciousness, perhaps influenced by the subtle effects of proximity to active structures, or perhaps evolving through independent processes, appears to be changing in ways that multiple observers have noted. We're becoming more sensitive to electromagnetic fields, or more capable of accessing information through non-conventional means, more aware of dimensions of reality that were previously imperceptible. Whether this represents natural human evolution or whether it's being catalyzed by interaction with ancient technology, the effect is the same. We're changing. And as we change, we're becoming capable of perceiving and interacting with things that previous generations couldn't access. What James Sullivan touched beneath the Antarctic ice in 1958 defied physics as he understood it. But perhaps it didn't defy physics as it actually is. Perhaps it demonstrated physics that we haven't fully discovered yet. Principles of energy, matter, and consciousness that the civilization that built these structures understood, but that we're only now beginning to glimpse. The warmth, the pulsing rhythm, the impossibly smooth surface, the activation in response to contact, the lasting effects on human physiology and perception. All of these suggest technology operating on principles that integrate physical and conscious phenomena in ways our current science doesn't acknowledge. The structures beneath Antarctica are not just archaeological artifacts waiting to be discovered and cataloged. They're active components of a system we don't yet understand. A system that has been operating beneath the ice for an unknown period, that responds to human presence, and that apparently has the capability to modify human consciousness in precise and reproducible ways. Sullivan touched that system. He was changed by it. And his experience, documented in careful detail in his private journal, provides us with a roadmap for understanding what happens when humans encounter technology that operates on principles we haven't mastered, and that may have been waiting beneath the ice specifically for the moment when we would be ready to understand it. That moment is approaching rapidly. The evidence is overwhelming. The structures are real. And soon, whether we're ready or not, the truth that James Sullivan discovered in 1958 will become unavoidable for all of us. The question is not whether the structures will be revealed, but what we'll do when they are. How we'll respond to the knowledge they contain, and whether we'll be capable of integrating that knowledge without losing ourselves in the profound implications of discovering that we're not alone on our planet. We never have been. And that ancient intelligence left us something beneath the ice that's been waiting patiently for the moment when we would touch it and begin to understand what it means.